The alarms were screaming before I even opened my eyes. Red light bled through the metal walls of the transport ship, painting everything the color of warning. I was Ethan Cole, 28 years old, a junior attaché with the Earth Diplomatic Corps, and I had exactly 4 seconds to understand why my restraints had locked, and my chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible hand. "Brace positions," the ship's voice said. "Calm the way machines are calm even when everyone around them is not. Hostile scan detected. Ashari Border Patrol has locked weapons." I did not know in that moment that the woman who would soon become my wife was the reason those weapons had not already fired. 3 hours earlier, I had been reading a briefing file that told me almost nothing useful. Earth needed access to Ashari trade lanes to survive a war we were quietly losing on 3 fronts. The Ashari Dominion needed something too, though nobody in my chain of command would say exactly what. All I knew was that I had been chosen, against my own wishes, to be handed over as what the official documents called a goodwill consort to the reigning empress of a species I had never met, on a planet I had never seen, as part of a treaty I had never been allowed to read in full. I did not choose this. Nobody had asked me. My name had been pulled from a list, my file flagged as expendable enough to risk and presentable enough to send, and that was that. Somewhere in a boardroom on Earth, men and women in clean suits had decided that my life was a reasonable price to pay for 6 months of peace. The weapons lock held for 11 full seconds. Then, without explanation, it released. "Threat resolved," the ship's voice said. "We have been granted passage." I did not learn until much later that the Empress herself had ordered that release, before her own council had finished arguing about whether to let us through at all. She had heard something in the frequency of our engines that the sighted officers around her had missed. She always heard things first. The palace of the Ashari Dominion did not look like a palace. It looked like something grown rather than built. Curved towers rising out of black stone like fingers reaching for a sky that had no sun, only a soft violet glow that never brightened and never fully dimmed. I was marched through corridors lined with guards whose faces were unreadable to me, past rooms filled with a hush so complete it felt like pressure on my ears. Nobody told me she was blind. I found that out standing in front of her throne, when I bowed the way the protocol officer had drilled into me for 6 straight hours, and she did not look at me at all. Her voice was low, unhurried, carrying an accent that curled strangely around the Earth words she had clearly learned only for this moment. "I can hear that your spine is still bent. There is no need to bow to a woman who cannot see it." I straightened so fast I nearly stumbled. That was my first conversation with Empress Thera, ruler of the Ashari Dominion, and I had already managed to embarrass myself. She sat on a throne carved from the same black stone as the towers outside, her eyes a pale, clouded silver, fixed on nothing, moving very slightly as though tracking sounds I could not hear. Her robes were dark red, trimmed in a metal that shimmered even in the dim light, and her hands rested on the arms of the throne with a stillness that felt practiced, the way someone holds themselves when they have learned that every twitch will be noticed and judged. "You are Ethan Cole," she said. It was not a question. "I am, Your Majesty. Your heart is beating very fast." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and she made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly swallowed. "They tell me you are a gift," she continued, "a symbol of your species' willingness to bow before mine. I do not require gifts, Ethan Cole. I require allies. Since my council insists on gifts, I will accept you as a formality, and we will both pretend this arrangement means nothing more than paper and ink." "That sounds fine to me," I said, and I meant it, because at that point in my life I wanted nothing to do with any of this. I wanted to go home. I wanted my apartment on the coast, and my ordinary job, and my ordinary problems. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." We were married 2 days later, in a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes and involved no vows from either of us, only a ritual exchange of scent-marked cloth that her attendants explained meant nothing to humans and everything to the Ashari, a way of saying this person now belongs, at least on paper, to this house. I stood beside a woman I had spoken to exactly once, in a hall full of nobles who watched me the way you might watch an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong, and I became, officially, the consort of an empress who could not see my face and had made it very clear she did not particularly want to. Afterward, alone in the rooms assigned to me, rooms with no windows because the architects had never imagined a ruler who needed light, I sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed and allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel sorry for myself before I made a decision that would end up changing everything. I decided I was not going to hide in these rooms for 6 months, waiting for the treaty to expire. The next morning I found my way, mostly by trial and a great deal of getting lost, to a courtyard where I had heard the sound of running water the day before. It turned out to be a garden, full of tall black-leafed plants that released a soft chime when the wind moved through them, a sound clearly designed for someone who lived by her ears rather than her eyes. I sat on a stone bench and listened, and I did not notice her until she spoke from somewhere behind me. "You found my garden." I turned, startled. Valthira stood a few feet away, dressed more simply than she had been at the ceremony. No crown, no attendants trailing behind her, just her, and a long walking staff that she used more like an extension of her hand than a support. "I heard the water," I said. "I followed it." "I didn't mean to intrude." "You did not intrude. Very few people come here. My council believes gardens are a waste of stone that could be better used for walls." She tilted her head slightly, the way I would learn she always did when she was truly listening rather than simply hearing. "You are surprised I am here without guards." "A little. They think I am fragile because I cannot see danger coming. They are wrong. I hear danger long before most of them notice it standing in the room." There was an edge in her voice, old and worn smooth, the sound of a complaint she had made many times and stopped expecting anyone to understand. I did not fully understand it either, not yet, but something in the way she said it made me want to. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You may ask, I may not answer." "Why me? Out of everyone Earth could have sent, why did your council agree to a human at all?" She was quiet for a moment, and the garden chimed softly around us, wind moving through black leaves. "Because a blind empress married to a foreign symbol is easy for my council to dismiss," she said finally. "They believe this marriage weakens me further in the eyes of other houses. They believe I agreed to it because I am desperate, because I cannot rule alone, because a queen who cannot see the world needs someone else's eyes to lead her through it." Her jaw tightened, just slightly. "They are wrong about that too. But it is useful, for now, to let them believe it." I sat with that for a long moment, watching her face, which gave away almost nothing, and finding myself, against every expectation I had walked into this palace with, curious about the woman underneath the crown. "For what it's worth," I said, "I don't think you need anyone's eyes." She turned toward me sharply, silver eyes finding a point slightly to the left of my actual face, close enough that it still felt, somehow, like being looked at. "That is a strange thing for a stranger to say." "Maybe, but you knew our engine frequency was safe before your own officers did. You knew my heart was beating fast before I said a word. You don't sound like someone who needs help seeing anything to me." For the first time since I had arrived on this world, Empress Valthira smiled, small and unguarded, and entirely unlike the careful stillness she wore on her throne, and I felt something shift quietly in my chest, the first loose thread in an arrangement that had been built, from the very beginning, to mean absolutely nothing at all. I did not know yet how wrong that beginning would turn out to be. I only knew that I wanted to hear that sound again, the water chiming through black leaves, and her voice, unguarded, saying more than protocol required. It was a small thing, a garden, a smile, but it was the first true moment between us, and every true moment that followed, all the ones that would eventually amaze her more than she ever expected to be amazed by anyone, began right there, on a stone bench, in the quiet after a wedding that was supposed to be nothing more than paper and ink. The palace did not make it easy for a human to survive inside it. I learned this within my first week, when I walked into a wall that every Ashari servant could sense from 10 feet away simply by the way sound bounced off its surface. I learned it again when I sat down at a dinner where every dish had been prepared for a species that tasted through scent rather than through the tongue, and I ate something that made my eyes water for an hour, while 3 nobles watched me with expressions I could not read, and did not need to, because their silence said everything their faces refused to show. Court life for the Ashari was built on stillness. Emotion was something to be sensed, not displayed, and a raised voice or an open laugh was considered almost indecent, the way shouting in a library might be considered rude among humans. I did not know any of this when I laughed, loudly and without thinking, at something a young attendant said to me in the kitchens on my 3rd day, a joke about the way I had mispronounced the word for bread so badly that it had accidentally meant something close to stone. The kitchen went silent. Every servant in the room turned to look at me, and I felt my face go hot, certain I had committed some terrible offense. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, unhurried, familiar, and a moment later Valthira appeared in the doorway, her staff tapping lightly against the stone floor. "What is that sound?" she said, and I realized she meant my laugh. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb anything." I did not say it disturbed me. She stepped further into the kitchen, tilting her head the way she always did when something caught her attention. "I have never heard a sound like that in this palace. Do it again." "Do what again?" "Laugh." I felt every servant in that kitchen holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when their Empress asked a human consort to perform for her like some kind of curiosity. I almost refused, out of pride, out of the small, stubborn part of me that resented being treated as an exhibit. But there was something in her voice that was not command. It was something closer to hunger, the sound of a person who had spent her whole life in rooms built for silence, suddenly hearing a sound she had never been allowed to hear before. So I laughed again, not forced, just remembering the joke, and I watched her face change in a way I had not seen it change before. Something softened, something opened. "It sounds like the garden chimes," she said quietly, "only warmer." After that, I stopped worrying quite so much about whether I was breaking rules I did not fully understand. I decided, somewhere in that first month, that if I was going to be trapped in this arrangement, I was at least going to be myself inside it, rules or no rules. It turned out to be the right decision, though not for reasons I understood right away. Ashari nobles communicated affection, respect, and even simple friendliness through careful, formal gestures, a bow of a precise depth, a specific placement of the hands, a controlled tone that never rose or fell too far in either direction. Valthira had grown up inside all of that, trained from birth to read the world through sound and scent and the exact rhythm of another person's breathing, and she had learned, long before I ever arrived, exactly what every formal gesture in her court was supposed to mean. She had never learned what it meant when a person simply stayed. I discovered this by accident, the way I discovered most things in that palace. 2 weeks after the laughing incident, I found her alone in a side hall outside the council chamber, standing very still with her hand pressed flat against the wall, her breathing tight and controlled in a way that did not match her usual calm. "Are you all right?" I asked. "Go back to your rooms, Ethan," she said, and her voice had none of its usual steadiness. I did not go back to my rooms. Instead, I walked over and sat down on the floor beside her, my back against the same wall, close enough that our shoulders almost touched, and I did not say anything at all. I simply stayed. For a long moment she said nothing either. Then, quietly, almost as though she was speaking to herself rather than to me, she said, "My council voted today to reduce the funding for the border settlements. Children will go without proper shelter this winter, because 7 men decided that stone for a monument mattered more than warmth for families, who cannot see me, to know I fought for them. Her hand curled into a fist against the wall. I argued for 2 hours. It did not matter. It never matters as much as they let me believe it will. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it, though I knew the words were small and unequal to what she was carrying. Why are you still here? She asked. You could go. This is not a formal audience. No one requires you to sit on a cold floor with a queen who has failed the people she is supposed to protect. I know I don't have to, I said. I'm here because I want to be. That's usually why humans stay places. Not because we have to, because we want to. She turned her face toward me, silver eyes searching for something they could not see, and I watched her expression shift from confusion into something I did not have a name for yet. You are saying you remained simply because you chose to, she said slowly, as though testing the shape of the idea. That's exactly what I'm saying. No one has ever done that for me. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and she pressed her lips together as though she could pull the sound back in. Every person who has ever stood beside me has been required to. Guards, advisors, even my own family. Duty holds them there, not choice. I did not know choice was something a person could offer. I did not know what to say to that, so I did the only thing that felt honest. I reached over and rested my hand lightly on top of hers, still curled into a fist against the stone floor. She went very still. What is this? She asked. On Earth, when someone we care about is hurting, sometimes we just touch their hand. It doesn't fix anything. It just says, I'm here. You're not alone in this. Her fist slowly loosened beneath my palm. I have never been touched without ceremony before, she admitted. Every hand that has ever held mine has been announced first, measured first, permitted first. This is, she paused, searching for the word. This is different. Is it bad? No. The word came out softer than anything I had heard her say before. No, it is not bad at all. We sat like that for a long time, her hand under mine, the council chamber doors closed behind us, the cold stone floor beneath us both, and I understood, somewhere in that silence, that something had shifted between us, that no treaty and no ceremony had ever managed to create. Over the following weeks, I kept doing the things that came naturally to me, without fully realizing how strange and new they must have seemed to a woman raised inside so much formality. I fixed a broken latch on her garden gate myself, instead of calling for a servant, because on Earth, that was simply what you did when something near you was broken and your hands were free. She found me there, tools scattered around me, and stood listening for nearly 10 minutes before she finally asked why a consort was doing work meant for tradesmen. Because I noticed it was broken and I could fix it, I told her. That's all. It didn't need to be a bigger thing than that. Everything in this palace is a bigger thing than that, she said, but there was something almost wistful in the way she said it, as though she wished, just once, that it were not. I started walking beside her through the corridors, rather than trailing the required half-step behind, the way protocol demanded of a consort. I started speaking to her plainly, without the careful formal phrasing her advisors used, telling her when I thought a plan was a bad idea, telling her when something she said made me laugh, telling her, once, when a comment from a visiting noble had clearly hurt her more than she let her voice show, that I had noticed, and that she did not have to pretend with me. Each of these small things chipped away at something in her, some old wall built out of a lifetime of being handled carefully because she could not see, treated as fragile because her eyes did not work the way everyone else's did. I was not trying to prove anything. I was only being who I was, the same person I would have been on Earth, unpolished and plain-spoken and entirely unfamiliar with the rules of a court built on silence. It was Nessa, her closest attendant, who first said it out loud to me, weeks later, catching me alone in a corridor with a look on her face I could not quite name. You should know, Nessa said carefully, that the Empress has never allowed anyone this close, not advisors, not family. She built her walls very young, when her own mother's court whispered that a blind child could never rule, and she has spent every year since proving them wrong through sheer control. Control over her voice, control over her face, control over who is permitted near her. She studied me for a long moment. You have not asked permission for anything, human, and somehow that is exactly what she needed. I did not know what to say to that. I only knew that whatever this arrangement had started as, paper and ink and a treaty neither of us had chosen, it had become something else entirely, something neither of us had a word for yet, growing quietly in gardens and cold hallways and small unasked-for gestures that no ceremony in her world had ever prepared her to expect. I did not know, standing in that corridor, listening to Nessa's warning wrapped inside what almost sounded like gratitude, that the real test of everything we had built so far was still ahead of us, waiting in a hall full of nobles who wanted nothing more than to see the Empress and her human consort fail in front of the entire Dominion. But that test was coming, faster than either of us expected, and when it arrived, it would not be gentle. The warning came from a man named Draos, though I did not know his name yet when I first felt his attention settle on me like a weight across the room. He was the head of the Council of Stone, the oldest and most powerful of the noble houses, a man whose family had produced advisors to the Ashari throne for 11 generations, and who had made no secret, from the moment I arrived, that he considered my presence in the palace an insult to everything his ancestors had built. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. He simply watched, from the edges of every gathering, with an expression so carefully neutral that it took me weeks to understand it was not neutrality at all, but patience, the kind of patience a hunter has while waiting for the right moment to move. I met him properly for the first time at a small gathering held in the Empress's honor, one of the quieter court functions where nobles came to trade information disguised as pleasantries. Valthira stood beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm, a public gesture she had begun allowing only in the last few weeks, and I felt Draos approach before I saw him, the way the room seemed to quiet slightly around his steps. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing with exact precision, "and the human consort, how the court delights in your continued experiment." "Lord Draos," Valthira said, her voice perfectly even, "I trust the settlement negotiations are proceeding without further delay from your house." "They proceed as swiftly as caution allows," he said smoothly. "One must be careful, of course, when so much has already been risked on matters of sentiment rather than strategy." His attention shifted toward me, though his head did not turn far enough for it to seem like a direct address. "Tell me, human, do you find our court difficult to navigate, given how much of it relies on senses your species apparently lacks the refinement for?" It was an insult wrapped inside a question, and I understood immediately that it was not really aimed at me at all. It was aimed at her, a reminder disguised as courtesy that the entire arrangement between us was, in his eyes, an embarrassment built on a queen's supposed weakness. "I find it takes some getting used to," I said evenly, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. "Most new things do." "How diplomatic," Draos said, and something in his tone made it clear he considered diplomacy from a human to be almost a novelty act. "I do hope the Empress has explained to you the nature of the Ascension Gala. It approaches quickly, and it is, shall we say, an unforgiving stage for those unfamiliar with our customs." He bowed again and withdrew before I could ask what he meant, leaving behind a silence that Valthira did not immediately fill. "What was that about?" I asked once he was out of earshot. "The Ascension Gala," she said quietly, "is held once each year to mark the founding of the Dominion. Every noble house attends. Every foreign dignitary currently within our borders attends. It is the single most public event on our calendar, and this year, because of the treaty, representatives from 6 other systems will be present to witness it." Her jaw tightened. "Draos has spent the last several weeks quietly gathering support among the council to use the gala as an opportunity to publicly question my fitness to rule. He believes that if he can embarrass me in front of foreign eyes, He can force a vote of no confidence before the season turns. And he thinks I'm part of that plan, I said slowly, understanding now. He believes you are proof of it. A blind queen so desperate for legitimacy that she married a symbol from a species most of the court considers beneath consideration. If he can make you appear foolish, or make me appear unable to manage even a simple public event without stumbling, he believes it will be enough to turn opinion against me permanently. I felt something harden in my chest, a protectiveness I had not fully expected to feel this strongly, not after only a few months, not for a woman I had married under circumstances neither of us had chosen, but it was there, undeniable, and I recognized it for exactly what it was. Then we don't give him the chance, I said. It is not that simple, Ethan. The gala is built entirely around visual display, formations of light, ceremonial dances that rely on the exact positioning of dozens of nobles moving in patterns I cannot see, and have always relied on memorized counts and Nessa's guidance to navigate. If Draos arranges even a small disruption to that pattern, a single missed cue, I will appear lost in front of every foreign delegation, currently deciding whether the Ashari Dominion is a stable partner worth trusting. I understood then the shape of what was coming. This was not simply court gossip or idle cruelty. This was a calculated attack, aimed at the exact place where her blindness made her most publicly vulnerable, timed to do maximum damage in front of an audience that included representatives from Earth itself. Over the following weeks, I watched Valthera prepare for the gala with a discipline that quietly amazed me. She practiced the ceremonial formations for hours each day, counting steps under her breath, memorizing the sound of specific instruments that marked each transition in the dance, training her body to trust patterns of sound the way a sighted person trusts their eyes. Nessa worked alongside her tirelessly, but I began to notice something troubling in the days leading up to the event. Members of the Musicians Guild, quietly and without explanation, began changing small details of the rehearsal music, shifting timing by fractions of a second, details so small that Valthera herself sometimes did not immediately notice, but that built, cumulatively, into a rehearsal that no longer matched what she had spent weeks memorizing. I brought this to her attention the night before the gala, having spent an evening quietly comparing notes with a young musician who seemed uneasy about the changes, but too frightened of Draos's influence to speak openly. They are altering the timing, I told her, sitting across from her in her private study, the garden chimes faintly audible through the open doors. Small enough that it might not even be noticed by the other dancers, but large enough that if you rely on the counts you memorized, you'll be a half step behind everyone else by the third formation. Her hands went very still on the table in front of her. How certain are you? Certain enough that I think you should assume it's true and plan around it, rather than risk finding out you're wrong in front of 6 delegations. She was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something that looked almost like fear pass briefly across her face before it was swallowed back into careful stillness. I have spent my entire life proving that I do not need to see in order to lead, she said quietly. If I falter tomorrow, in front of every house, in front of your own people's representatives, Draos will not need a vote of no confidence. The court will simply decide, on its own, that a blind queen was always a mistake, and no argument I make afterward will undo that impression. Perception, once broken, is very difficult to repair. Then we don't rely on the memorized counts, I said. We build something Draos can't tamper with. What do you mean? I mean I'll be there, beside you, the whole time, close enough to talk without anyone else hearing. If the timing shifts, I tell you, in real time, and you adjust. He can change the music. He can't change the fact that I'll be standing right next to you the entire night. She turned toward me, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw something in her expression I would not have expected from a woman raised to project unshakable calm, naked uncertainty, and beneath it, something that looked almost like hope, fragile and unfamiliar, the way hope often looks in people who have learned not to expect good things easily. You would do that, she said, stand beside me through the entire ceremony, whispering corrections, risking your own reputation among my court if it goes wrong. I'd do a lot more than that, I said, and I meant it more than I expected to, the words leaving me before I had fully examined why they felt so true. You're not just some arrangement to me anymore, Vale. I don't know exactly when that stopped being true, but it did. It was the first time I had ever shortened her name, an informality no one else in the palace would have dared, and I watched it land on her like something warm. No one has ever called me that, she said softly. Do you mind it? No. A small, unguarded smile crossed her face, the same kind I had seen once before in the garden, the very first true moment between us. I find I do not mind it at all. We spent the rest of that night working out a system together, low signals I could give through the smallest pressure of my hand against hers during the parts of the dance where we would be close enough to touch, quiet words during the formations where we stood apart, a language built entirely between the two of us that no amount of tampered music could break. Nessa joined us for part of it, quietly impressed, though she said little beyond offering corrections to my counting, which admittedly needed a great deal of help. I did not sleep much that night. I lay awake thinking about Draos's cold, patient expression, about the careful cruelty of a plan built to humiliate a woman for something she had never had any choice over, and about the strange, unexpected fact that somewhere in the last few months, protecting her had stopped feeling like duty and started feeling like something I simply wanted to do, the same way I had once simply wanted to sit beside her on a cold floor outside a council chamber. By the time morning came, and the palace began preparing for the Ascension Gala, I understood exactly what was at stake, not only for her rule, not only for the treaty that had brought me here in the first place, but for something far more personal that had grown quietly between us, in gardens and hallways and small unasked-for gestures. Draos believed he had found the perfect weakness to exploit. He had no idea that in trying to isolate her, he had only made certain that on the night it mattered most, she would not be standing alone at all. The gala would begin at sundown, though sundown meant little on a world lit by a permanent violet glow rather than an actual sun. Servants moved through the palace all afternoon, preparing the great hall with banners bearing the crests of every noble house, arranging seating for delegations from 6 different systems, testing lights that would pulse in complex patterns meant to accompany the ceremonial dance. I dressed in formal Ashari attire for the first time since my wedding, dark fabric trimmed in the same shimmering metal veil Thera always wore, and I stood in front of a mirror in my quarters, barely recognizing the reflection staring back at me. Nessa found me there, adjusting the final clasp of my collar with quick, practiced fingers. You understand what tonight truly is, she said, not quite a question. A trap, I said. A trap, yes. But also a test of something Draos does not understand at all. She studied me for a moment, her expression softer than I had seen it before. He believes love is a weakness, human. He believes it makes a ruler soft, easily manipulated, easily embarrassed. He has built his entire plan tonight around that belief. She finished the clasp and stepped back. He is about to learn how wrong he is. I did not correct her use of the word love, though it startled me to hear it spoken so plainly, because somewhere in the months since that first conversation in the garden, I had stopped being entirely sure the word did not apply. When I met Vale Thera outside the Great Hall, she wore ceremonial red trimmed in gold, her crown resting against dark hair pulled back in a style I had never seen her wear before, and despite the careful stillness she projected, I could hear the slight unsteadiness in her breathing, the same tightness I had first noticed outside the council chamber weeks earlier. "Ready?" I asked quietly, offering my arm the way her attendants had taught me. "No," she admitted, taking it anyway. "But I am no longer facing it alone, and I find that matters more than readiness." The doors opened, and the sound of the gathered court washed over us. Hundreds of voices, dozens of unfamiliar languages from the visiting delegations, instruments tuning in the distance, and somewhere beneath all of it, patient and waiting, Draos and his carefully altered music, ready to watch everything he believed would finally prove his Empress unfit to rule. He had built his plan around a queen who would face that hall alone. He was about to find out exactly how badly he had misunderstood the woman he was trying to destroy. The great hall was brighter than anywhere else I had seen in the palace. Hundreds of small floating lights drifting near the ceiling, pulsing gently in a slow rhythm that I would later learn was tied directly to the music. A visual language built for a species that mostly did not need it, except on nights like this, when foreign eyes were watching and appearances mattered as much as truth. Valethira and I walked the length of the hall together, her hand steady on my arm despite everything I knew she was feeling underneath, and I watched delegates from 6 different systems rise as we passed, offering the formal bows required by protocol. I recognized the Earth delegation immediately, a small group seated near the front, and among them a woman named Grace Bennett, the senior ambassador who had overseen the original treaty negotiations, watching me with an expression of open curiosity that I did not have time to fully register before we reached the ceremonial platform at the center of the hall. Draos stood near the musicians section, positioned exactly where he could observe every part of the coming performance, his expression composed into perfect, patient neutrality. He bowed to us both as we passed, and I felt Valethira's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on my arm. "He is close to the musicians," she murmured, too quiet for anyone else to hear. "That confirms it. The alterations will begin the moment the ceremony starts." "I'm right here," I said, matching her volume. "Whatever changes, I'll tell you. Just breathe." The ceremony began the way all Ashari ceremonies began, with a long, low tone from an instrument I did not know the name of, a sound that seemed to settle into the chest rather than simply the ears. Around us, dozens of nobles moved into their opening positions for the formal dance, a slow, sweeping pattern meant to represent the founding of the Dominion, each house taking its place according to rank and history. Valethira and I stood at the center, required by tradition to lead the opening formation, and I felt the exact moment the tampering began, a fraction of a second shift in the tempo, subtle enough that most of the hall likely did not notice at all. "Timing shifted," I murmured, my hand finding hers exactly where we had practiced. "Quarter beat early. Slow half a step." She adjusted instantly so smoothly that anyone watching would have assumed it was simply part of the choreography, and I felt a fierce, quiet pride rising in my chest at how completely she trusted me in that moment. Trusted a single whispered correction over months of memorized counts that had just been pulled out from under her. The dance continued, formation after formation, and 3 more times I felt the subtle shifts Draos's musicians had built into the performance. Small alterations, designed to accumulate into a mistake large enough for the entire hall to notice. Each time, I murmured the correction, my hand steady against hers, my voice pitched low enough that it disappeared beneath the music to everyone except the one person it was meant for. I watched Draos's expression change slowly across the hall, patience curdling into something sharper, as formation after formation passed without the stumble he had so carefully engineered. By the 4th alteration, his jaw had tightened in a way that even a species built on stillness could not fully disguise. Then, near the final formation, the one requiring the most complex pattern of movement, I saw him give a small, sharp gesture toward the musicians, and the tempo shifted dramatically this time, not a subtle fraction, but a full, deliberate jump meant to throw off anyone relying on memorized timing entirely. I felt Valethira's hand tense in mine, felt the half-second of panic ripple through her before her training could catch up, and in that half-second I made a decision that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with the months that had brought us to this moment. I stepped slightly closer, my voice steady even as my own heart pounded, and instead of simply correcting the count, I began speaking to her continuously, low and constant, describing exactly what was happening around us in real time. "Big jump, full beat," I said quietly. "Everyone else is scrambling too. You're not alone in this. Delegation from the 3rd system just missed their mark. Nobody's watching you right now. They're watching the confusion. Nessa's signaling from the left. She's got the recovery count. 3 steps forward on my word, now. She moved with me, not because the memorized pattern told her to, but because she trusted the sound of my voice more than she trusted anything else in that hall, and together we recovered the formation so cleanly, so seamlessly, that what should have been a moment of public humiliation became, instead, something entirely different. Because the sudden tempo shift had confused several other noble houses as well, dancers who relied far more heavily on visual cues than Vale Thera ever had, and while 3 separate formations across the hall fell briefly into visible disarray, the Empress and her human consort moved through the chaos without a single visible misstep, guided by nothing but a steady, whispered voice and a hand that never let go. By the time the ceremony reached its close, the murmur moving through the hall was not about the Empress's supposed weakness at all. It was about the extraordinary sight of a blind queen navigating a moment of total confusion more gracefully than sighted nobles who had spent their entire lives training for exactly this kind of performance. I saw Grace Bennett leaning toward the delegate beside her, saying something I could not hear but could easily guess the shape of, and across the hall I watched Draos, standing very still, his carefully composed neutrality finally, completely broken, replaced by something close to disbelief. His plan had depended entirely on isolating her, on exploiting a weakness he assumed she carried alone. He had never accounted for the possibility that she would not be alone at all, that a human he considered an embarrassment might become, instead, the very thing that turned his sabotage into her greatest public triumph. After the formal ceremony ended, and the hall shifted into the quieter reception that followed, delegates from every system approached to offer their compliments, several openly praising the Empress's composure during what they clearly assumed had simply been an unfortunate musical error rather than deliberate sabotage. Vale Thera accepted each compliment with practiced grace, her public composure fully restored, and only I could hear the slight unsteadiness still lingering beneath her voice, the aftermath of adrenaline she had not yet had time to release. It was well past midnight before we finally found ourselves alone, in the same garden where everything between us had first begun, the black-leafed plants chiming softly in a night breeze that carried none of the tension of the hall behind us. She sat on the same stone bench, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing finally, slowly, evening out. "You saved tonight," she said eventually. "Not simply the formation. Everything. If I had faltered in front of 6 delegations, Draos would have had exactly what he needed." "We saved it," I said, sitting beside her. "I couldn't have done any of that without you trusting me enough to move on nothing but my voice." "That is precisely what amazes me," she said quietly, turning her face toward me the way she always did, searching without truly seeing. "I have spent my entire life being protected by duty. Guards protect me because they are assigned to. Advisors guide me because it is their function. Even Nessa, who I love as family, cares for me because she has done so since we were children, and it has simply always been true." Her voice softened further. "Tonight, you stood beside me not because any treaty required it, not because any duty demanded it, but because you chose to, in the exact moment it mattered most, and you did not once hesitate. I told you before," I said. "You're not an arrangement to me anymore." "I know." A small, unsteady breath left her. "I have known for some time, if I am honest. I simply did not expect to be shown it so completely, in front of my entire court, by a man my own council believed I had settled for out of desperation." She reached over, finding my hand in the darkness with the same certainty she had shown all night, and held it. "No one has ever fought for me the way you fought for me tonight, Ethan. Not because it was required, only because it was true." We sat together in the quiet garden for a long time after that, the chimes moving softly around us, neither of us needing to fill the silence with anything more than the simple fact of staying, and somewhere in that stillness, I understood that whatever this had started as, a treaty, a formality, an arrangement neither of us had chosen, it had become, without either of us fully planning it, something real enough to fight for, something worth every risk the night had asked of us. Draos's plan had failed completely, but I understood, sitting there beside her, that his failure was not the true ending of anything. It was only the beginning of a much larger fight still waiting ahead of us, a fight neither of us could yet fully see the shape of, though for the first time since I had arrived on this world, I found I was not afraid to face it. Because whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone, and neither would she. News of the gala spread through the palace faster than any official announcement could have managed, and by the following morning, the story being whispered in every corridor was not the one Draos had planned to tell. I heard 3 different versions before breakfast alone. In one, the Empress had sensed the sabotage before it even began, and simply chosen not to react, proving her senses sharper than any sighted noble in the hall. In another, the human consort had somehow predicted the entire plot days in advance, and quietly warned the Musicians' Guild to hold their composure regardless of pressure. The truth, quieter and less dramatic than either version, mattered less at that point than the impression the night had left behind, an impression that worked entirely against the man who had engineered it. Nessa found me in the eastern hallway shortly after, a look on her face I had not seen from her before, something close to open delight. 3 houses have already withdrawn their support from Lord Draos this morning, she said. House Kellen sent word before sunrise. House Orin followed within the hour. Even members of his own Council of Stone are distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with a plot that so thoroughly backfired in front of foreign delegations. Because the tampering was noticed? I asked. Because it was noticed, yes. But more than that. Nessa's expression softened. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, the court did not see a blind queen struggling to compensate for a weakness. They saw a ruler who had built something Draos could not touch, could not manipulate, could not turn against her. He tried to isolate her, and instead the entire hall watched her prove that she was not isolated at all. That is a far more damaging outcome for him than a single ruined formation ever could have been. I found Valthira later that day in the same council chamber outside which we had once sat together on a cold stone floor, though this time she stood inside it, facing her assembled council directly, her posture straighter than I had ever seen it, her voice carrying none of the careful restraint she usually reserved for these rooms. I was not required to attend, but I stood quietly near the doorway, listening, and I watched her address Draos directly for the first time since the gala, her tone even but unmistakably sharp beneath its calm. Lord Draos, she said, you spent considerable resources attempting to prove me unfit to rule in front of 6 foreign delegations. I would like the council to understand exactly what that attempt has cost this house. Not simply in the support you have already lost this morning, though that loss is considerable. It has cost the Dominion the confidence of at least 2 visiting delegations who now openly question whether internal Ashari politics are stable enough to guarantee the treaties currently being negotiated. Her voice did not rise, but it did not need to. You gambled the credibility of this entire Dominion on a personal grievance against my marriage, and you lost that gamble in front of the very audience you needed most to impress. Draos said very little in response, his usual composure visibly strained, and by the end of that council session, though no formal punishment was issued, I understood that his influence within the court had been quietly, permanently diminished. He would remain a noble, remain wealthy, remain present at future gatherings, but the patient, dangerous authority he had once carried through every room he entered had been broken, not through violence or punishment, but through the simple, undeniable fact that his plan had failed in the most public way possible, and everyone in that hall had witnessed it. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the palace that went beyond simple court politics. Delegations that had arrived cautious and skeptical about the stability of an Ashari throne, led by a blind Empress, began, quietly, to change their tone. Grace Bennett requested a private audience with Valthira less than a week after the gala, and though I was not present for the entire conversation, Valthera told me afterward that the Earth ambassador had spoken with unusual directness about wanting the treaty expanded, not simply as a temporary arrangement to secure trade lanes, but as the foundation for something longer, something built on genuine trust rather than desperate necessity. She said something interesting, Valthera told me that evening, as we walked together through the garden, no longer needing the careful half-step of protocol between us. She said that watching the two of us during the ceremony convinced her more thoroughly of Earth's potential partnership with the Dominion than any negotiation document ever could have. She said trust between species is difficult to manufacture through paperwork, but easy to recognize when it is witnessed firsthand. She's not wrong, I said. No, Valthera agreed, a small smile touching her mouth. She is not. Over the following months, the treaty that had begun as a fragile, uncertain arrangement grew into something far more substantial. Trade routes expanded. Joint settlements were established along contested border regions, staffed by both Ashari and human administrators working side by side for the first time in either species' history. I found myself, without ever formally applying for the position, serving as an informal liaison between the two governments, translating not simply language but expectation, helping each side understand the other's customs in ways that official documents rarely manage to capture. None of it happened easily. There were setbacks, disagreements between council members who still distrusted the arrangement, moments where old suspicions resurfaced and threatened to unravel months of careful progress. But each time, Valthera and I faced those challenges the same way we had faced the gala. Together, her instincts sharpened by senses no council member could match, my willingness to speak plainly, cutting through formalities that too often obscured rather than clarified real problems. I remember one evening, nearly 6 months after our wedding, standing beside her on a balcony overlooking the palace grounds, the violet glow of the sky settling into its evening dimness, the garden chimes barely audible from this height. "Do you remember," she said quietly, "the first thing I ever said to you? You told me to stand straight, said there was no point bowing to a queen who couldn't see it. I was testing you," she admitted. "I wanted to see whether you would be like every other diplomat who had ever stood in front of me, performing courtesy for an audience I could not perceive, all show and no substance." She turned toward me, silver eyes finding their familiar place slightly beside my face. "You have never once performed for me, Ethan. Not that day, and not in any day since. Never saw the point," I said. "Seemed easier to just be myself." "It was more than easier," she said softly. "It was the first honest thing anyone in this palace had offered me in longer than I can remember, and I did not fully understand how much I needed that honesty until you gave it to me, without even realizing what a gift it was." I thought back, standing there, to everything that had brought us to this moment, a forced marriage neither of us had wanted, a garden where a smile had first cracked something open between us, a cold hallway floor where a simple touch had meant more than any formal gesture her court had ever offered her, a gala built entirely to destroy her, turned instead into the moment that proved, beyond any doubt, exactly how strong the foundation between us had become. None of it had gone the way either of us expected when we first stood together in front of her throne, strangers bound by paperwork and political necessity. And yet somehow, standing on that balcony 6 months later, I could not imagine any version of my life that did not include her. "Can I tell you something?" I said. "Always. I used to lie awake those first few weeks, furious about being sent here without any real choice in the matter. I kept thinking about everything I'd lost, my apartment, my ordinary life, all the small things I never thought I'd miss until they were gone." I paused, searching for the right words. "I don't think that way anymore. I haven't in a long time, actually. Somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like something taken from me and started feeling like something I would have chosen anyway, if anyone had ever bothered to ask." Her hand found mine on the balcony railing, steady and certain the way it always was now, no hesitation left in it at all. "I did not choose this marriage either," she said. "My council arranged it as a formality, expecting nothing more than paper and ink between us, exactly as I once told you myself. Her voice softened further. But I choose this now, Ethan. Every day since that garden, I have chosen it freely, and I will go on choosing it for as long as you allow me to. We stood together on that balcony for a long time after that, saying very little, needing very little more than the simple fact of each other's presence, and I thought about how strange it was that something built entirely on necessity, on treaties and desperate diplomacy, and a council's cold calculation, had somehow grown into the truest thing I had ever known. Later that night, back in the rooms that had become, somewhere along the way, simply our rooms rather than separate quarters assigned by protocol, she asked me the question she had begun asking most nights, a small ritual that had grown between us without either of us planning it. "Tell me about the stars again," she said, settling beside me, her head resting against my shoulder. She had asked me this many times by then. She knew, better than I ever could, the shape of the void beyond her world, understood orbital mechanics and stellar classifications with a precision that put my own knowledge to shame. She did not need me to explain the stars to her. She had told me once, quietly, that she simply liked hearing them described in my voice, liked the particular way I always started with the same 3 stars visible from my childhood window, the same small, ordinary memory returned to each time like a familiar path worn smooth by walking. "There were 3 stars I could always find first," I said, "the way I always began, just above the tree line behind my parents' house. My mother taught me their names before I could even properly pronounce them." "Tell me," she murmured, her breathing already slowing, comfortable and warm against my side. And I did, the same story I had told a dozen times before, familiar and unhurried, her hand loosely holding mine in the quiet dark, and somewhere in the middle of it, I realized that this, exactly this, was what neither of us had known to expect when a treaty had first placed us side by side. Not grand gestures, not dramatic rescues, though we had certainly had our share of those. Simply this, a quiet room, a familiar voice, a hand that stayed, night after night, choosing to remain exactly where it wanted to be. Empress Vale Thera had ruled her dominion since she was young, guided always by senses sharper than sight, by instincts that had never once failed her in matters of politics or danger. But it was not politics or danger that had truly amazed her, in the end. It was something far simpler and far rarer, something no treaty could have manufactured and no council could have arranged. It was the quiet, unshakable fact of being chosen, freely and completely, by someone who had never needed permission to stay. And every night since, in the soft dark of a palace built for a queen who read the world through sound, she fell asleep to the sound of my voice, and I fell asleep knowing, with a certainty I had never expected to find so far from home, that whatever had brought me to this strange and beautiful world, it had also, somehow, brought me exactly where I was always meant to be,